an organisation called EveryMan Australia, and it's built into a trusted organisation that helps men with a range of issues take control of their lives. And he's with us in the studio, CEO of EveryMan Australia, Gregory Aldridge. We call you Greg, don't we?
Yes, please call me Greg.
Okay.
I don't know who that other guy is.
Yeah, it's like when people call me Rodney. I think, no, that's what my mother used to call me when I was really, really bad.
In a
Quite
loud,
often.
in a loud and angry voice.
No, when I was really, really bad, it used to be Rodney Stewart Gordon. Anyway, we're getting off the...
Only slightly. You've just missed the point. Greg's here.
Yeah.
Just to celebrate the fact that he had been nominated as the senior ACT Australian.
Well, I wasn't going to mention it since he missed out.
No, when he was...
he was. Yeah.
The nominees, when the finalists were...
Look, anybody that gets nominated
Friday.
for the Australia of the Year
I agree.
is a winner, really, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So
how'd you do
how
it?
disappointed are you?
Sorry,
So how disappointed are you?
I'm really not disappointed at all. The woman who won was absolutely lovely. She came up and gave me a huge hug afterwards, as if I was the person who'd won. And, 50 years volunteering for St John's Ambulance is absolutely amazing. But being there and having the work that I've done recognised was just
It's good.
It was phenomenal.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the work you've done for 2 decades
I was
now,
going to start with that, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Because obviously you deal with some rather complex blokes with rather complex issues. Are these people who fall through the cracks of the existing services that might be provided by government, or how does EveryMan Australia fit into the equation?
Look, most of them have spent their lives falling through cracks. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that a lot of guys, the guys that we work with, don't tend to fit neatly into other services.
Mm-hmm.
They're often loud, aggressive, people who aren't used to expecting people to be interested in what they've got to say.
Sure.
And what we've done over the last 10 years is work out how to work with guys with complex needs in a way where we can engage them. And I think the biggest factor in our success is that we're just known as a men's organisation. We're not known as a mental health organisation or a prisoners organisation. We don't exist to fix up a particular type of problem. So if a guy comes in who's got mental health issues, you're not a schizophrenia with a man attached. You're just a guy who's got some issues. And I think that allows the men who get referred to us to assume that they're coming to a place that's going to be interested in them as men, not interested in the problem that they have.
I suppose the title EveryMan Australia explains that Catholic-wide view of any man and every man is welcome to your services.
That's right.
But how do you get to your services? Do you have to be referred?
Well, you can refer yourself, or
you can.
your partner, or your mum, or your next door neighbour. Anybody can refer. We do have some programs that are funded through Justice and through the ACT government, where a referral pathway is pretty well established, and they can be a bit harder to get into. But even our violence prevention services, any guy can contact us.
Is there an overlap with Men's Link?
Well, we have a good relationship with Men's Link. In fact, in our early days, we had a lot of overlap between our board members and Men's Link board. That was back in the days when it was the Men Mentoring Men program run through Woden Youth Services.
Then you've got Men's Shed too. I guess you've got a lot of organisations. Do they actually talk to each other? Obviously, Men's Shed and Men's Link, EveryMan Australia, I'll get it right in a sec. EveryMan Australia and Men's Shed, Men's Link, obviously, you've got a little bit of overlap there.
Oh, we do. In fact, Martin Fisk and I have lunch once every 6 weeks, just to make sure we keep that well maintained.
Do you get a word in?
I think we both give each other a good go. Martin and
He's
I
a great
are
guy.
quite equal in that
He's
respect.
a great guy. I love interviewing him because we don't have to work.
I can imagine.
Well, okay. Let's talk about some specifics. 2 decades on, Greg, what have men changed?
Yeah,
have their needs changed?
Look, it's an interesting question. Years ago, when the now defunct White Ribbon organisation started up, I got involved in that around the same time as I joined the Domestic Violence Prevention Council, and it was really interesting going out to shopping centres and places to, do things like sell ribbons. The older guys would tend to look at it, and if they didn't have their wife there to hold them by the elbow and bring them back to us, they'd be off like a shot. They wouldn't want to talk to us. Middle-aged guys were sort of, they were sort of interested, but, for a guy that they knew. The young guys were amazing. They'd come up and say, "Oh, you already heard about this." They were really open to talking about what the issues were. So in the domestic violence area, I think people, guys have really shifted. And there's a lot more acceptance, I think, by the guys who are having problems with violence or, finding themselves building up, and they're worried about the fact that, they could explode at any moment. They're more likely to seek help than they used to be.
And that's a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. I remember in my very early years at EveryMan getting a phone call once from this guy. He said, "Oh, look, me and me buddy want to do one of your anger management programs." I thought that was really interesting. And then I got another guy rang up and said, "Look, something really bad nearly happened last night." So I think what's happened is that it's created a lens for guys to start looking at themselves and say, "This thing that I'm going through, it's a thing. It's not just me."
But are men recognising thresholds more subtly than they used to? I mean, those guys were basically volunteering because they self-recognise they had a problem.
I think what they recognise is what's going on outside of them. They can see their kids looking scared, or they know that there's stuff happening at home that they don't want to talk about. There's still a world of guys out there who just continue to say, "Oh, well, it's all her fault," or, "She made me do it," or "It's no big deal." And often they're guys who grew up in, violent circumstances themselves, but not always.
Well, what if it is her fault?
Well, nobody's ever responsible for somebody else's violence. I mean, that's a really strong position for us. As soon as you start to go down that road, then you start arguing with people over whether what they did was justified. So, look, if you've got problems in your relationship, you need to sort them out without being violent to people.
Well, you say here that these people, you give them a voice and the tools they need to overcome tough times. What kind of a voice do they express, and what kind of tools do you provide them with?
Well, we run individual counselling and group programs. We also run a supported accommodation for guys who are in the system because they've got complex needs. So very often they're the ones who've grown up in families where they've been exposed to domestic and family violence. If there's drug and alcohol use, they've often got acquired brain injury, things like that. So we work with guys who don't just present with one problem, they've usually got a raft of them. And so that's where our approach really makes a difference to them. So we work with men who've got a bunch of problems. So we use counselling and case management and supported accommodation to engage them over a long period of time. Because with these guys, you've got to be able to go the distance with them in order to make a difference. So what they get is they get tenacity. We'll continue to work with guys. We work with guys a lot. They'll go into jail and then come out, and we'll just keep working with them. It really takes something to get excluded from our programs because they're the guys that we want to work with. So one of the things that we do offer is an organisation that's geared up to work with people with complex needs. Years ago, when I was working in the out-of-home care system, I worked alongside of disability organisations that would occasionally take on one of the young people that I was working with because they wanted to be able to support those young people too. And what would happen is that they blow their service structure out of the water because most of their clients were less intense and less challenging with their behaviours, and they'd often break down. Our service works predominantly with those guys, so all of our resources are allocated and balanced to make sure that we've got the capacity to support each guy on whatever it is that he's presenting with. We've got a counselling service that's evolved specifically to work with men and men's issues. It's experienced as a very practical service. You go in and you've got a problem, you get practical advice, and over time you're encouraged to start to talk. So there's no expectation that a guy should know how to talk about everything that's going on with him straight away. You give them the time to learn that they actually get something out of that instead of making them wrong because they already don't know how to talk about things.
So you build a confidence.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't want to hog it, it's okay.
No.
But Greg, you say you're an advocate, or we know you're an advocate for changing the way we understand men's violent and aggressive behaviours. Where's the fine line, if there is a fine line, between condoning and not being judgmental at the same time? I mean, obviously, you've got to win the confidence of these people, but deep down under, you must be saying, you scum, in some cases.
Look, I have to say, it really doesn't happen very often.
Must be occasionally,
my
though.
co-founder Gerald Franks had a great saying. He used to say, look, the legal system deals with the crime, we deal with the man. And, some years ago when the ACT did its first investigation into deaths related to domestic violence, I remember sitting at a meeting of the Domestic Violence Prevention Council while the report was being read out of some really key deaths in the ACT's history. And the guys who'd committed the most horrible murders, when they talked about what was known about them as they were growing up as children, was they lived in environments that if you looked at the details, it would just make you shudder. And I remember the thing that really struck me at the time was the destruction of children. What these guys were in some ways were like husks of human beings because of what had been beaten and tortured out of them. So when I look at the guys in front of me, I make no assumptions at all about what's happened to them to make them the way that they are, but we still need to hold them to account for their behaviour and say, okay, terrible things happen to you and you hurt someone else, and our job is to help make sure that you don't ever do that again.
So you're on a permanent learning curve, I guess, with as you go along and as you build your service up, which is built up pretty well already, I know. But the fact that you'd never, there's not a one size fits all, for another cliche, where you've got to sort of put the various tools that applied to one, you can't apply them to another.
Well, I think that's right. A lot of the guys that we work with, they have neurological damage. They have problems, particularly with drug use. There's always something that's going to create a new wrinkle in the way that they present themselves. One of our biggest challenges, and probably where we're really effective, is working with the wider system. In understanding that a lot of these guys have got multiple agencies and multiple people involved with them, and trying to manage that's really helpful, because these guys often don't have the ability to talk to people about what they're experiencing in those systems, particularly if they've got neurological damage, if they didn't go to school, then they don't know how to speak to people. They spend a lot of time pretending.
Greg Aldridge, CEO of EveryMan Australia, is our guest for this half hour. Back in just a moment.
Call and join the discussion on 6255 1206. The City News Sunday Roast, 1206.
2CC.
22 past 10 on the Sunday Roast. Greg Aldridge, the CEO of EveryMan Australia, and also one of the nominees in the Senior ACT Australian of the Year for his work with mental health, or men's mental health in Australia.
Greg, we've talked about domestic violence. There's got to be more to men's problems than that.
Oh, absolutely. We've worked with an enormous diversity of problems. I remember, a couple of them stand out. One was an older Indian gentleman who'd come over to Australia for an arranged marriage. And she took him for everything that he was worth, and he came to us desperate and suicidal because he was ashamed of having failed and didn't want his family to know.
Yeah.
Really desperately what he needed was to go back home and find a family that was going to look after him. But in his culture and in his family, that was never going to happen. 60 to 70% of our guys are functionally socially isolated in some ways. So we get a lot of people coming to us who need help with stuff that they can't get help with through family or support, social networks, because they don't have them. Well, we had a guy who, these are probably stories that people don't want to hear on a Sunday morning. We had a guy who came out of jail. He'd been convicted of a particularly gruesome homicide. And a week later, we got another guy coming out of jail who'd been convicted of almost exactly the same crime. We worked with ex-bank robbers. In fact, one of my favourite clients back in the early days was a guy who'd done 20 years for bank robbery. And, when he got out, he just knew he was never going to be a criminal again, and he just wanted help establishing himself in housing, becoming independent, learning to live outside of the justice system. And, he'd come in and say, I was an idiot, for most of my life. I used to wander around with a gun in the back of my pants. But I liked him because of who he was right then. And we could offer him some really practical help to have a life that wasn't continually affected by everything that he'd ever done before.
Can people change?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I did.
This sounds like a story.
Sometimes I look at those guys over the other side of the counter and think that could have been me. I mean, I grew up in a pretty rough neighbourhood. People around my neighbourhood formed the Barbarians Motorcycle Club, which is now the South Australian chapter of the Hells Angels. It was a pretty tough neighbourhood. And what I saw was a lot of the guys that I grew up with actually had another side to them, which you could see when you were, dealing with them privately. But out there in public, they were tough and hard. And the tough and hard would get them in trouble, and eventually it'd get them into jail. And when they got into jail, they got worse. And the only way that you've got access to supporting people to leave that behind is to work with them when they come out and to be able to do that in a sustained way.
I've heard that said quite often, Greg, that, they say if you're not a hardened criminal when you went into jail, you would be when you came out.
Yeah.
I guess there'd be some truth to that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I understand why it is that people have to go into jail because they can't be out in the community. But often when they come out, they're not really able to access support that will help them have a different life. And I remember once being at a Canberra restaurant and this guy came up to serve our table. I looked up at him and he was a bit embarrassed because he recognised me. He'd been in our supported accommodation program. He'd been in a lot of trouble when he was younger, and I think he was finally settled enough that he could actually hold down a job, and he was really worried that something might happen because of my presence there, where his employer might find out something about his past. But he was a lovely guy, and I remember what he was like when he first came in, and he was not somebody who I could imagine would have ended up waiting on tables in a restaurant. So.
You ever wearied of this procession of anxious people?
Well, no, because I don't have to work with them directly. Look, I spent most of my working life before I came to EveryMan on the front line. And what my co-founder Gerald and I decided was that we wanted to create a place where guys could come to get the sort of support that would really make a difference to them. Gerald worked in the supported accommodation area, so he had a client load. But I ran our counselling service and the admin side, and so I was able to focus on building up the structure. So I don't get tired of the guys, because really I talk to them when I'm on call, which I do once a month, and I talk to them sometimes when they come up to the front counter. But my job is building up a team who are really keen to develop themselves to be able to work with this population. And, they're pretty tough, so finding a good
thankless.
team...
It can be pretty thankless at times.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had guys go out. In fact, our violence prevention manager, one of his first clients who went out to visit him at home, the guy was about to hang himself in the garage. A couple of times they've had to deal with, going to people's homes and finding that they've died of drug overdoses several days before. We've got quite a good relationship with forensic cleaning services. Some of that stuff is pretty tough to deal with.
Very confronting.
But we've got great team spirit, and we really support and train our staff. We coach them. We make sure that they've got good resources to support them in the work they do.
Greg, good on you for what you're doing,
yes,
and keep doing it, because obviously there's a need for your services and for your generosity and your dedication. Good on you.
How do people reach EveryMan?
Well, you can ring us or use the contact page on our website. That's actually, the contact page is really good, because anybody who does what, when you go onto a website and you do that little contact us form and you click submit and you think, well, I wonder what's going to happen to that. Ours goes straight into a database that I monitor with my managers like every day. Really interesting thing to look at, the sort of requests that come in there. But that's really the best way to do it. You'll get picked up and responded to, usually within a day.
So if anybody just wants to go into Google, for instance, and go EveryMan Australia, that's where they'll find
look for the Contact Us page, or you can call us on 6230 6999.
6230?
6999.
6999. I'll write it down just in case we
Just in case you need it.
Yeah, I'll catch up with you next week. That's right. Good on you, Greg. Thanks so much for coming in.
All right, thanks for having me.
Coming in.